Angelo Nasios, welcome to Head on Fire. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited. I have been mainlining your show, which is Hearth of Hellenism. Is that right?
Correct.
So for folks who don't know you or your platform, tell people a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do.
So what do I do? So the Hearth of Hellenism blog and podcast is a relaunch of the blog that I had originally on Pathos Pagan. That was back in 2017, and it went on until 2019 when I left Pathos. And then, pandemic hit, and we all went into, this limbo for a couple of years. And then I finally relaunched it last year. And I do, I talk about Greek history, culture, religion, polytheism, specifically the ancient religion. I'm very interested in those things. I am a practitioner of Greek religion, so I am a polytheist, and that's kind of what I do. And what I also do is I point out and talk about appropriation specifically, and how Hellenism is appropriated in the pagan community more broadly.
But you're not just coming at this from somebody who, grew up reading some books or watching some shows and got interested in it. You went to school for this.
Yeah, so I went for undergrad in religion and then for history as my master's.
Yeah. So I think that it's interesting that you have these kinds of intersections of expertise in something that most of us took a class on in 6th grade. So actually, that's kind of where I want to start. So for most of us, the idea of Greek culture, Greek religion, is really all wrapped up in Greek mythology, which for a lot of us here in the United States, if you're a kid in the US, you had a little unit on Greek mythology. I had it in 6th grade. Rocked my socks because I feel like, especially for a certain age group, you were either a dinosaur kid, an Egypt kid, or a Greek mythology kid. And I was absolutely a Greek mythology kid. Like I was a 10-year-old walking around with Arthur Cotterell's Encyclopedia of Mythology, which may I show you?
Yes,
I still have. But I read it so much as a child that like the spine is broken. It's like all separated from its binding. And I had to go out and buy a second copy to keep on my shelf.
Yeah.
Because my copy was far too well loved. Anyways, but for folks like me whose introduction into this world was a unit when you were a kid, what's the difference between what we think we know and what it is that you actually study?
I'm trying to understand the question a little bit. Like compare
so for folks, absolutely. So we tend to equate all of Greek studies, Greek religion, Greek culture, Greek with Greek mythology.
Okay.
What is the difference in what we think we know about ancient Greek life, ancient Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek practice, from that little unit on mythology that we all had, where your teacher's like, oh, on these days, the Greeks would go and they would go to the temple of Zeus and give an offering, and they believed this and that, and the actual like formal academic study.
Okay. So I think the distinction needs to be made between mythology and then theology. Theology, just talking about the gods, literally as the word it means. So mythology is part of theology in the sense that, the myths talk about the gods, but the actual, what does the religion entail? What do you see in the religion, the religious practice? Mythology will inform religion in terms of the establishment maybe of a cult or festivals, things that there's an interplay between mythology and actual praxis. But the mythology itself, so where I would draw the line is in terms of like the gods themselves. So, people will say like, oh, how could you worship those Greek gods? Zeus does horrible things. Like the gods are petty. I think that's the thing when you take a unit, like say on Greek history or things like that, they very they very much specifically focus on the Homeric representation of the gods and their human character, their human nature. And to me, that is very more of a pop culture, or like the common way to approach things. Let's say in the ancient world, like what is the, in society, what does the farmer think versus what does the philosopher think? You're going to get two different approaches to that. Maybe the farmer does, think in terms of, the gods having personality, and I don't want to offend. Maybe they're going to I'll anger the god and they're going to punish me. Maybe they have that mentality. But if you go to Plato, they're not going to necessarily have that sort of like perspective. So I think that's usually what's often always overlooked when you study the ancient Greek society and culture. They will push the philosophical, the mysteries, the deeper understanding of things more towards the side and marginalize that as like philosophers disagree, but that's just the opinions of elite men, and that's not really representative of a more broader understanding of people. And I don't kind of like that perspective. I think it pushes the narrative that everyone believe that the gods are petty or they're capricious, and it makes it into it's this. I feel like it's the same thing with any religion. Let's say Christianity. Let's do a comparison. People will say like, oh, how could someone believe XYZ thing about Christianity? But there's also theology. There's what does a theologian think is different than what a literal take on the Bible. You know what I mean? So every kind of religion, society, and culture has this dichotomy between the exoteric and the esoteric, the public, the private, the commonly understood, and the privately taught, or the more deeper reflective thought on that conversation. So I think that's what I have to say on that first question.
I do want to very quickly define a term that some listeners somewhere who are not familiar with studying religions or theology in any kind of way might have a red flag suddenly come up. You said the word cult earlier, which for anybody who's ever studied any kind of religion, we all know what you're talking about.
Yes.
But for those who are unfamiliar with the term in a more historic sense or in a formal religious studies sort of sense, could you define the word cult?
So cult is, in its most basic sense, is the care of a god. So the cult of Dionysus, for example, would be just the group of people who would be in that association, maybe affiliated with a temple, a priestly caste of priests or members, and they would just worship that god, have a temple, for example, and the cult is essentially the cultivation, or you get the word culture. It's all rooted in this same word of caring for and cultivating something. So it's not like the modern usage of the negative sense of a cult. And even cult itself isn't used in religious studies. They don't use that word because it's problematic.
So it's not the ancient QAnon then?
No, thankfully not.
So one of the things that I'm always interested in whenever I read academic writing from somebody that actually does the formal study like you do, and actually does this investigative work into history, is the way that modern perspective has been able to coalesce an entire narrative, to turn all of ancient Greek myth into a single unified narrative that becomes this single unified story. If I pick up Edith Hamilton's mythology, I can see everything from the creation of the world to its destruction and all points in between. You can do something similar with Norse mythology. There's the Norse creation myth, and it goes all the way to Ragnarok. And it's easy whenever we're looking at all of this from 2023 eyes to think, oh, well, every Greek, every person of this ancient religion, ancient people, believed all of this in this order, all of this in this format, all of this to be factually true, all of this to be the way the world worked. Is that in your understanding accurate? Was there this great coalesced, unified narrative that was understood by ancient people, or not?
I definitely think that is present to a certain degree. It depends on how you approach certain things. I like to examine things in terms of scale and layers. Like I always say, everything is stratified. Everything's very stratified. What topic, what genre, what school of thought. But if you want to take like a very large scale view of the ancient Greek world in its totality, so we're talking about like 1,000 years. Let's just say 1,000 years from like, let's say, classical to late antiquity. The end. So like 500 BCE to 500 CE, that 1,000 years. And you want to do an evaluation, I think you could construct a grand narrative of a very unifying thought. And of course, there's always exceptions to that. So if you look at, for example, education in this 1,000-year time period, for example, what was the bedrock of the education in the Greek world? It was Homer. Everyone knew Homer, like how we would probably know the backstories of superheroes, for example. We all know like Batman's backstory and his childhood and how he became Batman and all these sorts of things. That's it's just in the atmosphere here.
Mm-hmm.
So like for the ancient people, in the Greek world, the Hellenized world in the East, after Alexander, they used Homer to educate themselves, to learn to write and read. It was all based on Homer. So everyone knew all the stories based on Homer. So that's like a very, just basic broad education level. So whatever you can get out of Homer, people would refer to Homer and quote him and, make references to Homer, like, how we make memes today, how we will quote a movie line, people would quote Homer. So there's that. And then you have mystery cults. So you have the Eleusinian mysteries, you have Orphism, you have all these different cults. So, and the cults, I think, all have very similar teachings to them. So, at a certain point, you have different cults, different initiations, different mysteries, but very similar threads and thoughts and what they're trying to teach and what they're trying to give to the people. And so I think that there is common understanding, common discourse, and whatever arguments that are being had and the back and forth, let's say philosophically speaking, between the different schools of thoughts, they're all having a conversation within a cultural context. So I think you have unifying thoughts and streams of ideas, and then you have disagreements, but it's all like it's all contained in some sort of context. There's a context to it, a vocabulary, terminologies, and they're all working these things out.
Was Homer a real person?
Tradition says he is,
I know, and I try not to do way too much research, mostly because I feel like when interviewers do way too much research for an interview, they come off as like, well, I know everything and I'm leading you to an answer. But I did poke around a little bit, and I did find out something that was new to me in the past week, is that there is this theory that Homer wasn't a real person, or at least not one person, that it was a bunch of people that all wrote stories. That all wrote stories under the moniker of Homer. And I think something similar has been said about Shakespeare, maybe that there wasn't one Shakespeare, that there were multiple people writing for Shakespeare.
To me, honestly, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Homer was a singular individual or a collective group of writers. I'm not interested in necessarily that issue. Like my tradition says, he was, it's Homer. I'm going to leave it at that. If I'm also, as an academic, interested in the question of like, who was Homer, but for ease of conversation, we'll just say, Homer.
I feel like if somebody wants to take this plot bunny and run with it, because I'm not going to do it, I feel like there's a really fun YA book to be written about a group of 5 teenagers whose names all start with the different letters of Homer and come together to become Homer, and they create the narratives. I think there's a fun story to be told there.
Okay. That's a good one.
There you go. Somebody just give me a fee. I don't care. If you want to write the book and publish it, great. I don't. So, just send me a fee. I do find it interesting how often the myths seem to like disagree with themselves or rewrite themselves. I was just recently re-listening to Mythos by Stephen Fry, and he'll make references to, oh, well, in one version of this myth, this happens, and in one version of this myth, this happens. So even in this grand unifying narrative, there are differences of opinion. There's different ways of telling the story. There's different outcomes. It's a very kind of choose your own adventure style of reading it. From an academic perspective, why does that occur? And is it I mean, lots of different theories that these stories were created or retold at different points in Greek history, or it's like you kind of brought up earlier, well, what does the fisherman believe versus what does the scholar believe?
Yeah.
How is the story told in this town versus how is the story told in that town?
Yeah.
So why will, folks who are doing a casual read of something like a Mythos by Stephen Fry, how do these differences in myth come about?
I think primarily it is all about localization and where the myth is being told. So instead of, like say the Bible that has, like a very firm narrative, but even the Bible, you have different versions. The Gospels, again, even in a religion such as Christianity, which is very systematized, you have like, the 7 last words of Jesus, like each gospel has a different thing that he says. Well, what is, so so you look at the Greek perspective where there isn't a systematized, version of that. Things are very localized, so the myths will take on local characters based on where it's being told. So like who is the parent of such and such a figure? Like the Dionysus has different mothers depending on what tradition, and I think it's just based on that local tradition and how it has to then maybe adapt to a new tradition coming in. And so it keeps previous versions in and with the new version coming in, if that makes sense.
It does, and it actually leads me to another point that I don't know if I ever actually heard this in a classroom or if it was more in kind of these informal talks that you'll listen to. But there's this idea, this explanation that the reason why Zeus was so prolific in his couplings was because as this, again, I'm the idiot asking the expert. As the worship of Zeus spread, they had to have an explanation as to why this local deity now had to bow down to Zeus. So it was easier to create a story where Zeus had coupled with that deity to explain, like, oh, Zeus came in and now had babies or something. Does that share any relationship with academic thought, with the way that you all understand how these stories happen, or is that just something we made up on the internet?
No, it's hard to kind of remember where these things come from in terms of like where I read it, but this is something that it's out there in terms of like, migration patterns when different people come down into the Greek peninsula. Zeus, comes down into the region.
Literally.
Yeah. Seriously, yeah. And so it's a theory. It's one of the theories of Greek history and religion is as Zeus enters, the people who brings, now again, not Zeus entering. I caught myself there. It's
how many sex jokes can we make about Zeus in 3 minutes? Let's go.
It's people bringing the worship of Zeus down into the region with them, and the local deities then assimilate to this new system. That's why Zeus has many consorts. So all the local goddesses of the region would then become consorts with Zeus, and again, it localizes then Zeus's influence in that region. What's going on here? The old, the continuity from the old into the new. That is academic discourse over that subject. So that's kind of outside of how the tradition would understand those things. Like if you were like a person back then.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get into a little bit of some of that discourse and the way that modern eyes look back on these myths and the culture generally speaking, but really the myths where we look back on these ancient stories with modern eyes and give modern judgment towards these stories and the way that the gods behave or the way that people behaved. I know that, there's been a lot of discussion online lately that ancient Greek society had either a very different understanding or no understanding at all of what we consider today to be things like gender, gender identity, gender expression, sexuality, the concept of homosexuality, the concept of
Yeah.
bisexuality is something that we've kind of invented and projected into the past. Is that something that you're able to speak on or speak to in your area of study?
Yeah, so yes, definitely. So, from a historical point of view, when we talk about the ancient world and when we project onto the past our modern labels, we have to be very aware that we're doing that to avoid anachronisms. So like again, go like if you're on Twitter or on Tumblr, you see this all the time. People just saying, like, oh, using the word of like, let's say, oh, Alexander was gay. Alexander the Great was gay. He was bi, for example, like that, or the heroes or Hercules, or calling people in the past gay, for example. I don't think that is appropriate because those labels didn't exist back then. So they didn't have that kind of psychological sort of society. Didn't treat people that way and had a label and sub communities, how we identify in our communities today. So there isn't that parallel. So I'm trying to think of where to bring this now to.
Well, I mean, I think that it's interesting because I don't know. I feel like people have begun to use those kinds of labels and use those kinds of reflections as both a point of contention to say, oh, you're doing this wrong, or you're thinking about this wrong, of judgment, to project, like you said earlier, that the gods were petty, or that the gods were jealous, or that certain people were a certain way because they did or didn't do this thing in this story. Whereas I feel like all of that, from my cursory understanding of this subject, is it's just not a thing that we could possibly be doing. Like, we can't connect those directly. So saying that the gods are petty, or saying that this was, it is projecting modern sensitivities onto
Yeah.
ancient religion, ancient people, into a ancient belief system that just did not even have those concepts, and
Mhm.
may not frame those stories, may not frame those things the way that we would frame them today. Like, I know in a similar vein, not the same thing, but in a similar vein, I know you've talked about with Sarah Iles Johnston about the concept of witches in
Yeah.
ancient Greek myth, and how what we call a witch today and the kinds of definitions and meanings that we ascribe to that word were not at all shared by ancient Greek
Mhm.
culture. That concept just didn't really exist back then, not in the way that we understand it now. So
Yeah.
I think that in the same way, there are so many kinds of concepts, so many ways of looking at the world and of assigning judgments onto deities and peoples and cultures and actions that we are doing, that they wouldn't even have that framework. Is that
Mhm.
is that right?
I think so. Yeah. You have to, when you're studying the past, you have to really approach the past from their point of view and try to get
Mm-hmm.
into their shoes in terms of how do they look at society, how do they categorize things. That's like one of the things as the historian, like how do you like, for example, like sexuality in the ancient world, how do you understand that? And like, to me, I just think that, you know so our sources are mostly skewed towards the Athenian context. So when people say, "Well, the ancient Greeks," well, you're basing your idea of the ancient Greeks based on a lot of what you have from Athens, and then the rest of the city states. It's the sources and what you have, it will vary in terms of what's left behind.
I like that you bring that up, because it's very similar to saying something like, oh, in 100 years, we're talking about, well, what did people in the United States believe
Yeah,
300 years ago? And
it
it's
depends what
just,
city.
what did people in New York believe?
Yeah,
Versus what did somebody living out in the middle of nowhere in
yeah,
Wyoming, how did they frame what was
yeah,
happening around them? How did they frame different kinds of things?
yeah.
And I think that that's so interesting that we understand that because we're living in this, but we can't seem to project that onto Greece for
Yeah.
some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's something that we need to be aware of. Like, what are our sources? Where's the bias in the sources? Where do we lack sources? And be cognizant of that. And when we're reconstructing, like what did so and so believe in terms of sexuality or gender or all sorts of things, you have to really look at the sources of the time period, and then who is writing. So again, going back to like discourse, when I converse with people, in my conversations online, there's a lot of jumping between time periods. I've noticed where people will, they'll start here and then they'll go to the Hellenistic or maybe this period, and they kind of conflate things and they project onto the past some stuff, and it gets very jumbled. And I have to like kind of like, like your phone charger cord, and it's all tangled. I have to like untangle the cord and be like, okay, let's untangle this and let's kind of put everything into order.
Because, like we talked about initially, that entire narrative of Greek myth and belief and stuff that we see as a great unified narrative was something that was being constructed over thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say, oh, well, this and this mean this today, well, this might have been, like, from our perspective living in 2023, this might have been from 500 AD, whereas this might be from 2023. And we're trying to say that the people that lived in 500 AD and the people living today had the same context and same understanding and same everything, and believed all the same things for all of the same reasons. And I think that that's an interesting thing that you bring up consistently, and that people that do, this kind of more academic study of religion bring up. It's not just what was believed, but why it was believed, and why did they believe it? Why did people assign certain importance to certain things? There is, I'm currently writing a book about death, and because it's a big point of study for me right now, there's information that I know that when I am interviewing people for the book, they don't know, because I am looking at it from the academic. I am reading what has been written.
Yeah.
I am reading articles. I am reading this, and I am forming a narrative based on information. Whereas when I'm interviewing people, they might be telling me their perspective in context, or why certain information that I think is important because of what I have read isn't actually that important when it comes to the actual work that's being done in this field, because of all of this context that I don't understand because I'm not in that world. And then there's this whole third thing, which is lived experience, which is I am organically part of this world. I've grown up in these households where this is a discussion. I have grown up where I am part of this culture, this community, this topic of conversation. So you have like information, then you have people like doing the work and understanding the context, and then you have people that are organically already a part of the conversation, whether they want to be or not. So I think it's interesting that you bring up that sort of difference between information and context and lived experience to your study and your work and the kinds of platform that the platform that you're building. What is the importance between information and context, and how does somebody learn it?
Information, context, and how does somebody learn it? Oh, wow.
Because, and I want to get into this because I feel like there are a lot of people that think, well, I'm doing my research, and what that means online to people who are interested in this subject for whatever reason they're interested in it. I'm doing my research. I'm going and reading articles. I'm going and watching YouTube videos. I'm going and doing this. I feel like when people say that, they're not understanding that there is a difference between knowing information and being able to put it into context. And then there's this entire third thing where you are a living organic person inside of the topic, whatever that you're studying.
So I feel like you just have to never stop learning. First of all, there's never, I've learned and I've mastered, especially when it comes to like history, because there's always more to learn and understand, and different, new theories to kind of apply and look at things and reevaluate. But when it comes to specifically history, and almost anything in society. I think the one thing that I've taken away from doing my graduate work in history is recognizing and acknowledging that everything is narrative in our society. The way when we talk about things, when we explain things, or everything, there's a narrative. And you said the word narrative too. It's like, what is the narrative? So when you're reading a book, you're watching someone's YouTube video, they're presenting something in a certain way for a specific narrative, because narrative is a way to put something into understanding. And for it to make sense, it has to, in a story form, or it has an idea that's trying to get to a conclusion. It has to follow a certain train of thought. So I think people being aware of what is the narrative being told to you, what is the grand narrative, and I think a lot of things that we listen to or read are part of a grand narrative that we don't really recognize. And for being that we live in the United States, the grand narrative that we kind of live under is the narratives of Western civilization and what they kind of teach and what they put forward. And what I try to do is kind of be like, no, that's not the case. Like, no, like Greece is the birthplace of Western civilization. You hear that, and I'm just like, says who? I go, who invented that idea? And it wasn't the Greeks. The Greeks didn't say we are the birthplace of Western civilization. We didn't invent the idea of Western civilization. That came from, Western Europe. I think, and also there's a book that's coming out. And it talks about one of the popes who actually is the one who invented like this idea of European as an identity. Europeans. And Western civilization as a term itself replaced Christendom. So it was and then this narrative of Western civilization, what is Western civilization? Those people who made that idea and were building that structure, they looked back at the past and said, oh, we're going to put our foundations in Greece or in Rome. And that's what I'm saying. You need to be very aware of the narratives that you live in, the grand narratives that are being taught to you. Another thing too, like that falls into that is what the Battle of Marathon, in Thermopylae, and the Greeks fighting the Persians, and people would be like, oh, they saved us they saved Western civilization. And I'm like, no, we didn't. Like, we weren't, like, that wasn't a thing in our mind. Stop projecting your cultural narrative from the West of like the last couple hundred years, your identity onto a society and history that it doesn't exist.
It's and I think that happens. What are we looking at it for, and what were they doing? Why were they doing it? And what was the context 3,500 years ago?
Yeah. So that that's things that I look at, and to understand you have to really read. You really have to. It's hard to really give an easy answer to the question, because you have to I would say just read historiography. If you really want to understand these things, read historiography, ancient, medieval, modern. How do historians do history? Like, that's actually.
So I like that. Something that is similar in your work, and another former guest of the show, Dan McClellan, who does a lot of work with like biblical scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And dispelling fact from fiction when it comes to people's, I like how he phrases it, renegotiations of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Something that is similar in your work and advocacy as his is that you emphasize doing your research, and that the idea that like reading from a book, a lot of people will say things like, oh, I do my research, and then they'll show you their stack of books.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, here's I've done my research. I'm now an expert because I've read these. Here's all the books that I've read. And then they'll say a whole lot of stuff that's like, once again, taking very modern sensibilities and projecting it onto the past. And then you go look at the books that they read, because they think, oh, well, I've read books. I now know.
Yeah.
But I think what a lot of correct, because I think what a lot of people don't understand is that just because you've read a book doesn't mean that you've done the thing that you think you've done, because reading a book means that you are trusting that the person who wrote that book understood the subject well enough to be an authority on that subject.
Yeah.
Something you've talked about in previous interviews, something that he talks about in his platform, something that a lot of different kinds of scholars talk about, are just things like translations.
Yeah.
The reason that somebody will craft an entire narrative, they'll craft an entire point of view, write books on it, multiple books, based on an incorrect translation that they never bothered to check. Turns out they don't even speak the language.
Yeah.
They don't speak ancient Greek. They don't speak Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever it is. They don't actually speak that. They are also relying on translations, which were also incorrect. And now we have a better understanding of that. How does the reader, how does the interested person go about doing the research while making sure that they are critical of what they're reading and of the authors that are writing it?
Yeah. So you can always, when you're reading a book, you can always contact the author. I've done that. Like I'll be reading academic, books and stuff from professors, and I'm like, I'll be like, is this person still alive? And I'll Google them. Like, oh, they are. Like it's like depending on if it's a new book or an old book. Like I don't know if these people are still around or whatever, but I'll read like, let's see, like, can I get their contact info? Are they on Twitter? And I'll email them.
I'd never in a million years thought your answer was going to be, well, just ask the author.
Yeah, just ask the author. Seriously, I go, if you can get it straight from the horse's
Please don't email me. Please don't email me, people. Please don't.
But I mean, like,
if whatever I said was probably wrong, it's okay. I'm fine.
But no, like honestly, especially when it comes to like academics, professors who are publishing, I do think most of them do like being contacted because it's very hard to find people who are interested in these topics. So when someone gets an email saying, "I read your book," and I have a question about XYZ thing, I think they like that. And in my experience, when I've emailed professors and like, oh, I read that, I go, or can you help me? Like, I'm a student of history, do you have, they're more than happy, I think, on average, to be like, oh, here's a recommendation. Here's the clarifying like they like that shit, I think. So
here's what I love.
Okay.
I love talking to nerds who are legitimately nerds in a particular subject, who have formal academic expertise in a subject. And when I say reading a book, you are talking what I mean when I say read a book, and what you heard when you heard read a book. We're talking about two different kinds of books. Mm-hmm. Your kind of book is like written by a professor. It's published by a university press, and it published 30 copies. that author is thrilled that anybody knows their name. But when I mean read a book, I mean somebody like, I read Song of Achilles, and now I'm trying to reach out to Madeline Miller to ask her what she meant by this interpretation in chapter 12 of Song of Achilles, where she's never going to she's never going to see your email. She's never going to
you never know. Maybe, tweet them if they're on Twitter.
That's true.
I was on Twitter first. I'm like, if you're on Twitter, you're there to communicate.
That's true. I have talked to Alice Hoffman once, though she doesn't claim to be a scholar of anything.
Professors, if someone is teaching at a university, you can find their university email on the campus website. So you can just email them, and in my experience, they do like that. Like it's like, oh, like that's
just ask the author.
Just ask the author. Ask the author. I think and also just try to find the newest books that are coming out. Also, so if you're interested in a particular subject, find out what is the latest book that is out on the topic. So, for example, like Greek religion. If you're interested in Greek religion, everyone likes to recommend, read Burkitt, Greek religion. It's written from like 40 years ago. And Sarah Johnston, where we were talking about that on my podcast, where there's her husband is writing a new book coming out soon that's supposed to be like the updated kind of, hopefully the replacement of Burkitt. And it's like there's new information that needs to be put out there. And I feel like a lot of people, when it comes to, let's say, within the pagan community or polytheism, they're reading older books sometimes a little too much, and there's gaps there. So go and find out what's the newest books that are coming out. What are the newest theories? What's the conversation being had? I like to recommend people to get a copy of the Oxford Handbook to Greek Religion, because there's a lot of chapters in there about very specific things that are niche topics. So, and also find books that are specifically on individual topics. So something that is not a broad overview, but goes into a specific thing. So a book on, if you're interested in mystery cults, find a book that's specifically only on mystery cults. If you want to learn about the death and how, ancient culture dealt with death and the afterlife, get a book that's specifically on that. So find books that are specifically on those topics.
I like that advice, and I would give the same advice. I think that people also might want to temper that with an understanding of where they are in their own scholarship. If I am interested in science, if I am interested in gardening, and I want to learn more about that, going and picking up a book on organic chemistry written by a professor who's published through a university press and is writing for an audience of other scholars is probably going to leave me very confused.
Yeah.
Is probably going to be maybe even off-putting to somebody that doesn't have enough kind of prerequisites, right? Which is why colleges require prerequisites before you can take certain kinds of courses, because you need a foundational understanding of a topic before you can kind of climb that ladder. And I feel like at times people are so willing, or not so willing, so eager to kind of prove that they're serious about their scholarship, that they dive a little too far. And then what happens is they will read something that is way above their current understanding. And then they will come online to say, hey, I read this. I'm real confused. Don't understand it. Can somebody explain it to me? And then they get somebody that also does not understand it correctly, who explains it to them correct, who explains it to them incorrectly. Do you have a soft introduction to these topics for folks who are interested in it, either just because, hey, I read these myths as a kid and I really liked Stephen Fry, and I think it's cool when Neil Gaiman writes a book about this kind of stuff, this is fun. I'm interested in it from the MCU. I want to learn more. Yeah. I read Percy Jackson. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Do you have a couple of softer introductory books to recommend?
I think I would first recommend is Forget the Myths.
Oh,
as shocking as it says for people, like for example, like with me, like I grew up knowing many of the myths, but I'm not somebody who sits down to read every myth. And like I have favorite myths, but I know what the myths are there for me when I need them. I can go and look them up and read them and get whatever I need, the teaching I need out of it, for example. But I'm not like, when it comes to mythology, I'm not like the expert specifically on mythology, and I would advise people to like not focus so much on the myths and kind of like put that aside and just go and study the actual like religious life of religion itself, how it was done, the theories on religion, stuff like that. So if you're looking for specific books, what would I recommend? Again, Oxford Handbook of Greek Religion. It's like $45 on Amazon, I think, on paperback. Coping with the Gods.
Ooh.
That's a really good one. I really like that book. I forgot the name is escaping me at the moment.
That's okay. People have Google. It's fine.
Yes, they have Google. It's called Coping with the Gods. Again, that one might be pricey, but I'm just thinking of.
I bet your library can get it for you for free.
Yeah, that too. You can also go to the library and do it intraloan, so that's always a possibility. Drawing Down the Moon, not Margaret Adler. It's Edmund. Again, the names, I'm bad with author names, but it's a purple cover, and it's called Drawing Down the Moon, Ancient Magic in the Ancient Greek World, I think, something like that, if you look that up.
Oh, I was going to say, I was like, listen, I've read Margot Adler. I don't remember.
Not that one. It shares the same title, but it has a different subtitle to it, and it's a purple cover. That one's a great book on the conversation of magic. So if someone's interested in magic in the ancient world, go to that book. It's very good. I will have to probably make a list.
Please do. We'll put it in the show notes if you want to email one over.
I'll have to. Let's do that. I'll get back to you, and I'll give you a list
that'll
of
be
books
fun.
People should read. Yeah.
And through the magic of podcasting, if you look in the show notes right now, you'll see the list that Angelo put together for you. Congratulations. Speaking of books, what is your relationship? Do you have any like animus or do you love books like Percy Jackson? What are the thoughts of these sort of modern retellings of Greek myth for a young, inquisitive audience that likes hero stories?
Like, I think it's just entertainment, you know. Like, because I'm a polytheist, I'm always very torn towards these things. You know, if I was just a your run of the mill Greek person who is either Orthodox or atheist, because I think most Greeks are not really religious, so their opinion on it would be like whatever. Like, there's not strong opinions of things for most people. Me being really into the history and also being a polytheist, so these books being told, I mean, being written for like just the general audience, I try to accept it for what it is, as entertainment, and try not to get too annoyed or whatever. Like, whatever it is, it's entertainment. What I don't like is if there's certain ideas introduced in those books that are getting picked up and then getting brought into religious life. That's where I get a problem. Or just
Can you
general
give me an
ideas.
example of what that might look
Well,
like?
yeah, so American gods, like his whole theology of how gods, need worship to get power, like that idea, and that's
Yes.
something also you find in Supernatural, the TV
Oh
show.
yeah.
Like,
Gosh, I
so,
remember that episode way early in the life of Supernatural, where they were all in a diner or something like that, and they fought like all like. I remember Kali was like throwing
oh, the
fireballs or something like
motel,
that. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
yeah, and like so it's like this sort of theology, this pop cultural theology that's being written, which by the way is inferred by monotheism. So it's always going to be distorted because these writers, the culture around us, the audience is living in a monotheistic world. And so how do you write stories about gods? You have to frame them in.
Well, and that was so interesting. It's interesting that we kind of talked about Supernatural there, because the way that they ended up telling that framework is that sure, yes, the ancient Greek gods and Hindu deities and all of that, they're all very, very powerful, and yet they do still all bow down to the Christian God, who is more powerful than all of them.
Yeah, fuck that. So uh, when those ideas then trickle into polytheism as practitioners,
Mm-hmm.
it becomes a problem, and it becomes even more a problem when you have people saying they do Hellenism and then introduce those ideas into quote unquote Hellenism. It's it's making a mess of things. And also, like with Percy Jackson particularly, I have quoted, there's this article that someone wrote called about the latent white supremacy within Percy Jackson, and how there's a dialogue in the book where Percy asks, like, well, why is Mount Olympus on the Empire State Building? And the answer basically was, the gods are like part of the heart of the West.
The heart of the West. When you
Wherever
brought
the
up the
power.
Western civilization earlier, I
Yeah,
wanted to
and
ask
I'm
you
like,
about
what the
that.
fuck is this bullshit again? So it's just like, again, these narratives and how people tell stories, and they want to be like, oh, well, wherever the power of the West is, the gods go there, and it was in Greece, and then it was in Rome, and then it went to England, and now it's in America, and this is the answer in the book.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, this is fucked up, I mean, like, and then it's. And then that idea trickles maybe into polytheism or into spiritual communities where it's like, oh yeah, the gods move across civilizations, and they actually like leave people. Because if you take Percy literally, that framing, the gods are actual beings that actually physically move and leave places, and they go to cultures and then they leave them. And I think that's a problem. If people take that too seriously and try to bring it into a religious community and give it legitimacy through religious identity, instead of just leaving it where it should be, which is modern fiction.
So something else that people do in the modern day, actually, before I get to that, recently there's kind of been some scuttlebutt that there on the internet that there's an anthology of Greek myths, retellings, adaptations, that kind of thing, different short stories that have been compiled into this new anthology.
Yes.
And none of the authors are Greek, I believe.
Yeah, so I saw that on Twitter, and from what I saw from the conversation, and I'm actually was really impressed by everyone's sort of allyship and support of the Greek authors. So from what I understand was there was the anthology, there was Greek retellings, and there were no Greek authors included, even though there were Greek authors who submitted to be included. So they submitted their stories, and none of them were included.
So it gets to this point for me that when people think Greek myth, Greek culture, they think whatever that was, whatever all of that belonged to, the stories, the culture, the religion, the study, all of it, it all is now a single unified narrative that has been time locked and shoved into the past and is thousands of years ago, and all of that is dead and can be just resurrected and played with and rearranged and reinterpreted at whim because those people don't exist anymore. Those people are in the past. All of that is in the past. And I think people forget that Greece is a real place.
Yes.
With real people who still live there, whose roots are in the self same place.
Yeah.
So while I understand and respect that when it comes to this conversation of appropriation versus appreciation in the US, there is an intersection with things like other intersections of marginality, race, class, ethnicity, that kind of thing, where when people talk about appropriation, they oftentimes think, okay, well, you in the United States are somebody that we would codify in that very American lovely idea of whiteness. Well, we're all white and we can't do an appropriation to a white person or any white culture at all. All of it's for everyone's taking. I feel like that is the permission that people give themselves.
Yeah,
you're white, I'm white, everybody's white.
That's
so
still colonial thinking.
I can just sneak on in here and just be like, nope, I'm going to take that. And nobody can say bunk because we're all white here. And to an extent, I understand why that thinking exists because it comes from a sensitivity, a growing and correct sensitivity that, Black Americans have had it a whole heck of a lot worse than white Americans.
Yeah.
No matter what flavor of white you are, Black Americans have had it a whole lot worse. Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans had it a whole heck of a lot worse than the rest of us and do to this day. And yet, there is still a conversation that can be had about the appropriation of a culture that is not actually dead, that is still very much in a place that still exists and a people that still exist and might want to be a part of retelling their own stories.
Yeah, exactly.
So, from your perspective, why is it important for Greek authors to be involved in these modern retellings? What is it that other authors, like I think you brought up that Rick Riordan, I think is how you say his name, kind of gets some things wrong, even in his very well-meaning and very beloved adaptation, his modern retellings in the Percy Jackson and that universe. I think nobody thinks that he had any kind of ill intent. And I don't want anybody coming away from this episode thinking that we are doing some Rick Riordan bashing, because I think he's about as good faith as it gets when it comes to authors out there. But there are still some ideas, still some ways of thinking, still some perspectives that folks outside of that culture get wrong in their retelling. So what is the importance from your perspective of Greek authors and Greek voices being included or prioritized in the retellings of these stories?
Well, I think it's just inappropriate in terms of respect. If you're going to, for example, do an anthology of Greek retellings of stories, that it's literally the word Greek is in a Greek myths. And if you're not going to include Greek authors, apply that to any other culture, and I think people would see how it's wrong. But because how you say, people approach it as whiteness, it's not seen, so it's not obvious. So I just try to not have double standards. I think if we try to, apply the same standards across the board, if you're in America, you're an American writing retelling. Why are the American authors, allowed to be the majority and the only people who can be included in a book, but for some reason to suggest that a Greek author should be included is problematic, or it's not being inclusive. It would go against the idea of being inclusive if you include the Greeks, because somehow I don't know what's the logic behind it, because you're already Greek, so you don't need to be represented in your own culture and history and heritage, which I think it's hard it's hard for me to figure out what's the logic between whoever made that decision on, for example, that anthology. What was the thinking process? Because I'm pretty sure the stories were, you can't say all the stories were bad that the Greeks wrote. You know what I mean? So there's something else there.
Clearly, they're kind of the stories that inform the way that we tell a whole heck of a lot of other stories.
Yeah. So if the ancient Greeks were good enough to write myths that everyone wants to still read about, but the modern Greeks aren't, and we need to not include them. Let's silence them. I find it problematic. And our own perspective, I think it'd be interesting just to also hear, what do we have to say? What is our lives like now? What stories do we want to include? Because we have our own experiences. If you're like for me, I'm in the diaspora. I live in the United States. My father was an immigrant. So if I were to write a myth, I think it would be really interesting, from that perspective, as a Greek with dual identity and the struggle of your upbringing, and then assimilating to American society. How would I transform that and put it into a mythic setting? And that would be a very unique story to tell. That maybe someone else wouldn't write. And then now take that as someone living in Greece, what kind of myths and stories they could tell in the modern Greek setting where the ancient myths were told. It's just you're excluding stories that should be included.
So a lot of what your public scholarship and your work has been as of late is talking to people who are making different levels of attempt to revive, to reconstruct. I think is the very popular term, reconstruction, Hellenistic reconstructionism, or something like that, where a lot of folks, especially younger folks, are wanting to become worshippers of a certain deity. This kind of idea of working with different kinds of deities and different pantheons and stuff and different cultures has become very, very, very popular, especially with the advent of social media. TikTok has been a big deal about it, but before that it was Tumblr, before that it was Facebook, where social media has kind of turned, it's turned it into this kind of Pokemon style thing where we got to catch all the deities.
Got to catch them all.
You got to catch them all. You got to have all the deities. You'll see people talking about online that they work with 17 different deities, all from different cultures and different points in history, and it's very interesting to see how they negotiate that. But it's also interesting because we're talking about this difference between information and context and lived experience, and to see the ways in which the gods, the stories and stuff are kind of given this Pokemon style plug and play thing, in that there are these types and cross types. And it's oh, this deity is for love. This deity is for love and war. This deity is for death and motherhood. This deity is for this and this. And and it's I don't quite know how we get that.
Yeah.
If you have read the stories.
I think that it comes from older scholarship in terms of Aphrodite, goddess of love. So this whole idea of god of this, goddess of that, this categorization, I do think comes from the classical studies,
I
And
didn't know. See, I thought that was something that was more pop culture stuff that we assigned to it. I
it
thought
does come from older scholarship, and I think in the book I recommended, "Coping with the Gods," they talk about that, how to like that paradigm, and how you actually approach the gods. Like, what were their attributes? What were they known for? And how do we approach them instead of like a category of God of X? It's more of a map and a network of gods and how they interconnect with everyone. It's again, this is academic, approach and trying to understand these things. So, and I think just because of that, from the classical studies, I think that's where it might primarily come from. And then it trickles down into pop culture, and you get what you see, in common discourse.
So I do. I mean, I don't want to make it a whole thing, but there is, one of the things that you do is help people understand the difference between how these deities and how this culture is talked about on social media by these, you mentioned up top, by people who say that they fall under that umbrella of Hellenism or Hellenistic or whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Versus what it is that you understand about the actual culture. Like, what are those differences? I know that in your interview with Sarah Johnston, you all did make it a very generous point, I think, to say that both of these groups can work together and that there is a way of sort of beautifully marrying those concepts, and that concept, well, that the gods of the past are still the gods of today. They've just kind of evolved. They have continued to live, and they are, that kind of thing. But from your understanding and perspective, what is it that is happening? Is there something wrong with what's happening? What could these folks learn? What's going on there?
Like, in terms of the groups, you mean, like, for example, like
These modern pagan folks that are
yeah,
worshiping these deities, that kind of thing, negotiating these deities for a modern context and modern sensibilities.
I think what in the interview that I did with Sarah Johnston, we've talked about a lot about like respect.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, within paganism and the various, communities or cults, witches, these sorts of things, I think people really need to find proper labels. I'm really into categorization and proper descriptive labels of what's occurring. And so I think what people do is they read and they find in those books specific terms. Like, for example, if you read ancient history, you'll come across the word Hellenism. And it has its earliest meaning. It just talks about language. So Hellenism, Hellenismos, and the Greek word, just talks about proper Greek, speaking, writing, without any errors or flaws. It's a good Greek. And then later it expands, and it kind of includes like the culture itself, like more broadly. And then at some point, Julian, the emperor, is trying to turn the tides in the Roman Empire and try to, get rid of Christianity, or kind of like, reverse that stuff. And they didn't have a word for the religion, for their own religion, religious traditions and stuff like that. And so I think he was just trying to find a term to latch onto that people can kind of coalesce around. And he, it's thought that his idea of Hellenism was religion, but I think he was using the term more broadly as the culture itself. And then pagans will see that and say, oh, so the ancient religion, from projecting back again, they take Julian, for example, at the end of like he's at the 4th century Common Era. He uses the term Hellenism. He's the only one to use it in more of a kind of a religious tone. And then say, latch onto that, project it onto the past. Let's go back to Athens of the classical period. This is Hellenism, as a religion. I'm constructing it today. I'm doing Hellenism as a pagan because I believe in XYZ gods. They turn it into a faith-based thing. If you believe in Athena and Zeus, you do Hellenism. That's incorrect. That's appropriation, because how many Greeks are around today? Over 10 million, 15 million. And all of us understand what Hellenism is, which is our collective umbrella term for our identity, language, history, all that. So when pagans then take the term and try to create a religion out of it, they're creating a competing, hostile version that's supposed to, they want to harmonize. What's the phrase? Oh, let's just my Hellenism is different than yours, but that's fine. They want to be able to have it, and it's okay. It's like you can't do that because it's literally not what that is. So you're changing the definition of a word that people have been using for themselves.
Well, and folks, I think, found on the internet the word cultural exchange and then thought, oh, I'm not doing an appropriation, I'm doing an exchange.
It's not an exchange. What did you get back to me? Nothing. So my solution is to tell people, what are you actually doing? Because when we get into these conversations, people think that, oh, you're trying to gatekeep the gods. And it's like, no, the gods are universal. They are the gods of the entire cosmos. Anyone can worship these gods. But when you then go to the next step of trying to find the words to describe yourself, what you do, and then apply labels, you need to be very cognizant of what you're doing, because you are building something that might be hostile to something that already exists. So you need to, I tell people, I go, what are you doing? You're doing worship of the gods. What is that itself? Theology, for example, God worship. Literally, that's what the word means. And it's such a neutral term, for example. So I'm like, why don't you just use the word? Why don't you say you're a theologian? You are a God worshiper, and you worship many gods. I am a polytheist. Use that word. Hellenistic paganism, like create terms, kind of like play with these things, be creative, create something that is respectful of what already exists and what has existed, something that is accurate to what you do, something that you can build for yourself and have something. And then when we have that, then we can have inter-dialogue between, for example, myself and a pagan. And we can
see a lot of folks that kind of live in that pagan umbrella, whether people call themselves, say that they're practicing traditional witchcraft, whether they say that they're, some flavor of Reconstructionist or something like that. It's this appeal to ancient history. It's this appeal to lineage. It's this appeal to, I'm doing something that's valid and real and true because of how old it is. Look how old it is. And I think that there is this aversion to the admission that what it is that you're doing and the context that you're doing it are all pretty modern. And I think that it should become less of a distasteful thing to admit that, like, hey, we're doing a new modern thing now. I think that's kind of something that a lot of folks, a lot of voices, people like Thorne Mooney have done with other modern religions like Wicca. That is new. Charitably speaking, it's maybe 70 years old, maybe something like that, maybe 80, I don't know. And there is this idea that, like, no, we're practicing this unbroken line of witchcraft that goes back 1,000 years to Western Europe and yada, yada, yada. But it's like, no, it's become a much more accepted thing, even though it is still an unpopular opinion. It is still a truth that this is new. This is not ancient,
but it's still valid.
It's still valid. That's the thing, is that I wish people would get out of their own way that just because it's new doesn't mean it's not valid. It's still valid. It's still enriching your life. It's still doing something for you. You can still get something out of it. It just doesn't need to be ancient. It doesn't need to be ancient. It's okay. It's okay that it's something that we're all just kind of making up right now. That was something that Sarah Johnston...
It's funny because it's a very human attitude or behavior that we have even back in the ancient world. They always like to, back in the ancient world, anything that was considered ancient and old was considered better or more accurate or, less corrupted from the, the passage of time where, like the telephone game, so... so even the ancients, they liked ancient things by their standards because they thought it was, it's a very human thing. I think, humans want to avoid the idea of something being an innovation,
there's that idea that, like, I am doing something that people did 2,500 years ago. Well, you're probably not, but that doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't valid and isn't enriching your life in some kind of way.
Exactly. Like there are pagans who like to Platonize their religion, where they take inspiration from Plato and Platonic philosophy. Do I think they're Platonists doing Platonism? No, they're doing Platonistic paganism. That's how I look at it. Like, just let's really look at what you're doing and find an appropriate term that kind of describes what it is really, and just be done with it and move on. And we can actually then have conversations amongst each other. Like I see, like what I do in terms of my conversations with pagans, I don't see myself, as a pagan talking to pagans. I don't see myself as a pagan. I'm a Greek. And I feel like I'm having an inter-community dialogue or interfaith dialogue, like a Christian would have with a Buddhist, for example. Like two separate things, and we're having dialogue with each other. That's what I try to do when I want to have with other people, have a conversation, because we all are interested in these things, but we need to make sure we kind of like have our ducks in order, so we can actually have proper conversations and not get confused with
something that I do similarly is try to get people to understand that, like, when you're talking about the word witch or witchcraft or something like that, and people will start conflating, oh, well, here's what witches were back then, and here's what they practiced, and here's what they did, this and this and this, and they'll start conflating all of these different kinds of stories and ways of telling those stories. And they'll also lump in some folklore and some myth and all of that, and create this like cohesive narrative of what a witch was, instead of accepting the fact that the witch has always been both fact and fiction. There is the fictional witch. There's the witch that is a story character, that is a kind of archetype that appears in stories, which is why, you do see things like people trying to project back this idea of witches in ancient Greek myth or Norse retellings or whatever, even though maybe that concept as we understand it didn't exist. But they're trying to create this cohesive narrative of what a witch was. Well, no. There's always been figures that worked magic upon the world.
There's always the person who is marginalized within the broader religious kind of what's accepted in, again, society. What does society of a particular time and place accept as appropriate religious spiritual behavior or practice? And then there
were people that invoked magic to do, to fix the weather, to give them wind in their sails and all of that. But it wasn't all this thing that we now call witchcraft. It wasn't that. It's not that. There's all these different kinds of things.
There's words in culture that that people like to correspond to, like the modern words, so like witchcraft or witches. Where's that word in that society, and find the equivalent. So there is that. But again, like, what does it actually entail when you actually approach that culture, and what does that word mean, and what's included, what's not included? Again, that's a culture.
You're bringing up something similar. Mara Starling does that from a Welsh perspective, and she'll talk about, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the word, because Welsh is not a language that I speak, and I'm going to butcher it if I try. But I know that there is a word, like in English, she would say, yes, I'm a witch, I practice witchcraft. But in Welsh, there are multiple words that could mean what we say in English, and she chooses one of them because that is more aligned with what she understands that practice to be, which might not be the more common word. And it's like, well, you're picking out a word that you think, oh, is a person that does a magic. They're a person that does a magic, and then we're just conflating all of these. Like, people will put like shaman in there, or people will put all these kinds of words and put it together. Anyways, I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm not going to take up too much of it. I know you have a busy day. I do want to ask, do you have a favorite modern retelling or a favorite adaptation of Greek myth?
Oh,
I'm going to give you the out of, I don't necessarily mean it is the most accurate. I mean, do you have one that's just a fun comfort watch? Yeah, do you have what's your favorite?
Well, I have to be nostalgic, Xena.
Oh, yay!
Xena, I love Xena.
Nostalgic and gay.
Yes, very gay.
Xena, as gay as the Greek myths are in and of themselves, Xena really just ratcheted that up. just really just
it was just good.
increased.
It was again very entertaining. I liked it was the story and all that. But yeah, I think I had to be Xena. I'm trying to think of if there's anything else that really caught my attention. I think I really liked. I think it was Immortals with Henry Cavill.
Well, didn't we all love that one?
Yeah.
For various different reasons. I don't remember that movie having a plot. I just remember that movie having a nearly naked Henry Cavill.
Yes.
The entire time. I do also have a soft spot for the original Clash of the Titans.
Mm-hmm.
I did love that one. Well, okay, Angelo Nasios, thank you so much for your time. If people want to get a little bit more of you, where can they find you online?
Oh, they can find me on Twitter. Twitter is a good place to find me. I'm very active on Twitter.
And go subscribe to his podcast, Hearth of Hellenism. There aren't a lot of episodes, but each one is a gem.
It's on Substack. Yeah. So I do write. I try to write more than I do with audio. I'm building, a schedule. So I do have people scheduled, more scholars for future episodes. So I'm hoping to, really build something there and have good conversations with academics to, again, what you talked about earlier about how do people like learn these things and help them. I really want to build a podcast where I could bring the scholars on and ask them those questions and kind of pick their brain. So it would help people learn those things.
Well, thank you so much for your time. You have a good rest of your day.
You too. Thank you so much for having me.